absolutely honored to be here to speak with you today. It's just always a great pleasure to come back to the university setting. I'm fortunate enough to work with a really interesting cross-section of both the academic environment and the practitioner environment in the work that I do at the Center for CIO Leadership, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and certainly to be the lead-off speaker at an event like this. It's just really, really exciting for me, as I've spoken at many of these conferences, you can imagine. And after you speak at enough of them, what you discover, two things. First, size probably doesn't matter, but order does. And what that reminds me of is a conference that I spoke at a few years ago. It was actually on innovation and leadership in technology, very similar to this one. It was on in an academic setting. And I was asked to deliver the keynote address. And well, okay, it sounds like something that I could do. And when I spoke to the organizers, they said, you'll be speaking third. I'm thinking, third, gee, keynote address, why would I be third? And so in a break with my usual very humble style, I said, well, could I just ask who's speaking first? And they said, well, that would be former President George Bush, sir. And I said, well, okay, I guess maybe that, I could live with that.
I'm the third speaker, just so
it's a great spot to be in. Well, wait, there's more to this. So then I, screwed up all the courage I could possibly screw up, and it's like, well, okay, who's second? And they say, well, that would be General Colin Powell, sir. Okay, third's good, no problem. I can do that. So we did the speech and we did the event, and it was all wonderful, and there was all the press photos and all kinds of great coverage. But I did get my revenge. Just a couple of months later, at a family Thanksgiving dinner, I'm now showing off my photos, and there's me with the former president and the general, and I'm in the middle, and we're all shaking hands. And my nephew, who at the time was 8 or 9 years old, looks at this picture and says to his dad, my brother, hey, Dad, who are those guys with Uncle Harvey? So I got even in the end. But anyway, it's great to be here with you. And actually, order doesn't matter. I mean, we've got great speakers today, and it's a great event. And so let's talk about a critical success factor. You guys are all technology professionals and academic professionals. Of course, critical success factors, important outcomes are important. So let me suggest to you the following, very simple. As a result of what you hear today, what we talk about today, today's Wednesday, right? So Thursday is a work day in California still?
Yeah, yes.
I'm from the other coast, by the way, in case you can't tell from my accent. So when you go back to your office tomorrow, and you're opening your coffee or you're opening your tea or whatever floats your boat early in the morning, if you think about one thing differently as a result of being here today, or even better, you do one thing differently as a result of being here today, we'll consider that a huge success. Right? So just sort of keep that in mind as we go through the day. Thought I'd give you a little bit of background about the center. This is the group that I currently run. I actually started this almost 4 years ago. I think yesterday was actually our 4th anniversary. This was a group that was originally founded by IBM, although we are completely independent of IBM, so no fear that I'm going to be selling you cloud computing or any of that kind of stuff. But the intention here was recognition of the fact that the world has changed. This is now going back 4 years, even before the economic downturn. Enterprises have changed as a result. And therefore, the way IT needs to be thought about, the way IT needs to be deployed, needs to also change. And this was a tremendous, tremendous impact, and in many cases, sort of an unknown responsibility that falls on the shoulders of the CIO. And there really were not appropriate resources available, even now preciously scarce resources, to help CIOs to figure out how to be a better CIO. And this was specifically not about which cloud technology should I buy, or which middleware should I buy, or how do I implement a better governance process, or how do I figure out how to consolidate data centers, or whatever it may be. This was really about the skills and competencies of what CIOs need to embody. Because clearly, as the world has shifted, and we'll get into a couple of the dynamics in a minute here, what was clear was CIOs did need to have a different skill set. It was no longer about simply operational, tactical, keep the lights on and reduce expense year over year. The world was definitely heading to one of globalization, one of innovation. We've heard our introductory speakers all talk about innovation. We'll look at some research that was done around innovation. And in many cases, what we saw was that CIOs simply did not have these skills. Now, this was not necessarily a bad thing. Nobody was saying anything in a critical or judgmental way. It was just a fact. Many CIOs, and probably some of you in this room, have grown up through the IT organization, probably started out as programmers or analysts or whatever, and did really well at that, and got promoted to department managers and did really well at that, and got promoted ultimately to CIOs. But what many CIOs have never had was the opportunity to really learn about leadership, to really learn about organization and talent management, to really learn about communications and how you build relationships, both internally and externally. And so the center was really created to help CIOs figure out how to take the journey, as we now describe it, from that of manager of IT cost center to that of what we now call a business savvy CIO. One that is truly a leader, one that knows how to innovate, one that knows how to drive change through an organization. And essentially what we have built this thing into, as you can see from this slide, is now a peer community of over 3,000 members in over 70 countries and 45 industries in public and private sector, small, medium, and large. Diversity are us. I mean, that's literally what we call ourselves, and we fundamentally believe that every CIO on the planet has something to learn from and something to teach to every other CIO on the planet. And when you get a group of CIOs together in a room and you start having conversations, it's amazing what magic happens when people start to share. Actually, the original vision I had in mind when I started the center is what I called the overstuffed leather armchair experience. What is that? What occurred to me was I'd go to conferences all the time, some of them better than others, some of the speakers better than others. Inevitably, after the first day, during the evening, after dinner, there would be people that would convene in the lounge or whatever. And you're sitting in the overstuffed leather armchair, and you're having a wine or a brandy or a Diet Coke or whatever. And inevitably, somebody would come sit down next to you and strike up a conversation, totally serendipitous. And the conversation would head into, gee, you know, I solved that problem this way, or that's what you're doing. Oh man, don't do that. You know, we went down that path, and that's quicksand, and there's alligators in that swamp, right? So well, anyway, the point was, in that 10 minutes, the value of going to that conference, both time and money, paid for itself. And so my personal mission was figuring out how to bottle that experience, how to take those magical moments when that connection is made and the light bulbs go off, and how do I scale that? How do I get that kind of engagement, that kind of discussion going across 3,000 members and growing, by the way. We started 4 years ago with about 275 CIOs, so this thing has grown over 10 times the size in 4 years. So we think we're striking a chord. We think that we're doing something right, but still always in a learning mode. And essentially what we do is start with primary research. We then turn that research into thought leadership, so it's case studies or white papers or podcasts or whatever. We then work with academic partners like Pepperdine. We have partnerships with Harvard and MIT and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon in the US and lots of others, and INSEAD in Europe and Asia, Tsinghua in China, Cranfield in the UK, and we're constantly building new academic relationships. And we play in the space that frankly is the intersection between the academic world and the practitioner world, with the understanding that both are necessary, neither is sufficient on its own. And so as we create that convergence and look at things through the lens of the academic rigor associated with research and thought leadership, and figure out how to take all that good thought and apply it in a practical sense for CIOs on the ground who are dealing with these problems on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of the best of both worlds. So essentially we follow the cycle of research, thought leadership, education and outreach, and then we start all over again. So what you're going to see today is a bit of a snapshot at some of the research that we've done in the past, recent past, some of the research that we're currently doing, and frankly I'm going to be asking you, as Charlie said, for your input and your feedback, because for me, in addition to education and outreach for you, this is research for me. I want your opinion. I want to know what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Does this thing look practical? Is it more just interesting intellect? Or can this really add value? So let me just pause there for a minute. Any questions? I know many of you probably are, or some of you at least, are probably already members of the center. If you're not, by the way, I encourage you to join. This is not a commercial. It's absolutely free. There's no cost involved in any of this. On our website, you'll find about 450 now pieces of content, all available at no cost. This whole thing is funded through a series of corporate sponsorships, completely dedicated to the advancement of the CIO profession. So if you're not already a member, I would encourage you to join. Any questions about the center, what we do, or how we work, or why is this guy saying these things? Okay. So here's the backdrop. I referenced a bit earlier the new environment. Many people call it the new normal. Books have been written about the new normal. We didn't invent this thing. But I thought what would be really helpful would be to segregate the business drivers from the technology drivers, because they really are very separate and distinct, have different impacts. We need to have different responses to these things. As technology professionals, as business leaders, we certainly need to understand what these business drivers are and how we can then leverage these newer technologies, going back to the tablets and the laptops and the computers from our Gilbert cartoon, but figure out how to drive business value on the left side using the technology on the right side. First and foremost, and I'm not going to go through every one of these in gory detail. By the way, for those of you that are taking notes, these slides will be made available, so feel free to write down whatever you want, but you don't need to be. I've been at these things, people are literally taking pictures and seeing them on YouTube and Facebook walls. It's fine. Yeah, I have no problem with that once. I mean, frankly, one of the things I love about my job is I get to give this stuff away. So the wider the distribution, the happier camper I am. But you know, I'd rather you listen and we have dialogue rather than you spending your time writing notes. So whatever you're comfortable with. But in any case, globalization. Clearly, there's almost no company on the planet that doesn't have global reach somehow, whether it be the front office, the sales, the marketing, or that customers overseas, whether it be the back-end supply chain. I'm importing products, or I'm manufacturing products that are made from imported natural resources, whether it be a labor supply, labor pool. I've got customer service or call centers in 12 different countries around the world because of language issues. It is a global world. I think Thomas Friedman's famous book, The World is Flat, which was probably 8 or 9 years ago by now. Boy, that went fast. Probably said it best. But then add to that the role of government and transparency. I think certainly this is happening now more than ever. We look at what's going on not just in this country, but all over Europe, all over Asia, where it's unprecedented how much involvement we're seeing from government. Literally, industries are being bailed out by governments. When have we seen that before? Transparency is another huge factor. I know Joel's going to talk a little bit about the perspective of the public sector CIO, and in particular, sort of interesting, this whole notion of collaborative, open government and transparency in government really, in many ways, was ahead of the private sector around creating a window into what the government is doing for the first time, creating all kinds of interesting dynamics that I'm sure we're going to hear about a little bit later. This next one, actually the next several, are really, really, really key. One of the things we do, in addition to talking to a lot of CIOs, we also talk to other C-suite members quite frequently. So we talk to CEOs, we talk to CFOs, we talk to CMOs, get a sense of what they're looking for. CEOs demanding innovative business models. This is really interesting. This comes from primary research, by the way. I have another slide here which gets into this a little bit more, but this was actually a study that IBM did last year about what CEOs were looking for, not just from technology, but from their organizations. And in the space of innovation in particular, recognizing that their world is changing literally underneath them. They literally need to reinvent their companies almost in real time. And so what they're looking at is, and I think Charlotte alluded to this in her opening remarks, this is not about building a better widget. This is not about turning the crank on the assembly line and turning out more product a little bit faster. This is about a fundamental rethink of what business we're in. Does it still apply in this world? Do we really need to be end-to-end from customer to natural resource all the way through the supply chain? Or can we effectively partner with another company that is much better at handling the supply chain, especially if it's global, where our core competence is really understanding who our customer is and what their needs are? And you pick an industry, almost any industry, it doesn't matter. This is what CIOs are talking about, right? It's how do I figure out how to do better sales and distribution and essentially partner with somebody to do the rest. As just one example. Actually, Dell, the computer company, is probably a really good example. They, actually several years ago, came to exactly that conclusion. They partnered with UPS, who had been doing their package delivery. They basically said, geez, there's this whole thing about logistics and inventory control and the supply chain and figuring out how many boards we need to keep on the shelf and inventory and how many disk drives. And basically they came to the conclusion, that's not what we are put on this planet to do, right? We're here to figure out how to create the best computers and the best customer experience and the best distribution and sales. They literally did a deal with UPS to expand what UPS does for them way beyond package delivery to essentially be their warehouse, to essentially stock the shelves, which if you think about it was really smart because it freed up their management to focus on what they do best. It allowed UPS to expand their business pretty dramatically. Now UPS has a whole new business model where they're really, in addition to the transportation business, they're now in the inventory control and supply business. So it's the win-win-win. Just one example. There are many, many, many that go on and on and on. What's really interesting, getting back to the CIO opportunity, if you think about what we've been talking about here, CIOs are the only C-suite executives that have an end-to-end view of business from customer to ledger. So what that represents now is the opportunity for you folks to lead the charge, to lead the enterprise, to figure out, gee, we have, how many business processes did we talk about? 300 and some odd?
389.
389 business processes in Orange County. You'll hear more about that as well. And that's probably a small number when you compare that with something, a place like Citibank or General Motors. Every division of a company like that probably has 389 business processes. The CIO is the person that sees all of that and understands how all that stuff works and is in a position to say, hey, wait a minute, this part of it really creates value for our customers and our shareholders. This part of it, for all intents and purposes, doesn't. So why don't we figure out how to focus our energies here and how to create these collaborative relationships and partnerships to deal with the stuff that is, in effect, commoditized, where it's perfectly rational to say, let's just cut the cost. Let's, pencil is a pencil, right? Do we really need to worry about whether it's a number 2 pencil or a number 2.5 pencil. Let's let somebody else worry about that, or whether it's painted yellow or green. We're in the business of producing computers or cars or whatever it is we produce. So the CIOs really are in many ways in the catbird seat here. If they recognize they have that opportunity, if the organization they work for recognizes that this is a core competence of IT professionals. And I use the word if in both cases, capital I, capital F. And actually some of the research we're going to be talking about gets to the heart of what's going on in those spaces and what needs to go on in those spaces to make that fit much, much better. Focus on delighting the customer, again, another really, really, really critical component of this. We're seeing more and more and more emphasis externally. More and more companies have figured out it's not about our internally facing, how do we do the widget? Who's buying the widget? How many are they buying? How can we measure the value of that customer relationship and increase the value of that customer relationship? Enhance that customer relationship to make a loyal customer, because they know. It's interesting that Michael, in his very first slide, was it Dilbert or was it the Twitter address? But he showed the Twitter address for this conference. That's what's going on in the world. And guess what? People are listening to that stuff big time, much more than they're paying attention to the glossy brochures and the TV commercials. That's like what people are spending on the ads for the Super Bowl. Right? The world is changing. And it's changing the balance of power, in effect, towards the customer and the voice of the customer, even the tweets, even the reviews on Amazon, whatever website you look at, customers are paying attention to all that stuff. Customers are connected through social media and social networking, and that gets to the other side of the chart here. But these things all taken together paint a very, very different picture of what is business, what is enterprise, what is value at the end of the day to the shareholders, the stakeholders of that enterprise. And then, of course, you can't have a conversation with any IT professional without talking about risk management. And this is really a combination of the economic situation, the transparency situation, and frankly, it's accountability in its finest form as these changes start to happen. And thank goodness there is tremendous respect and understanding and observance of the fact that risk management needs to be in the forefront of what CIOs are looking at. And again, the distinction here, we'll talk about this a little bit later, this really is risk management as opposed to risk avoidance, which in the past I think there was a tremendous overlap and in many cases even confusion. Certainly from the CIO perspective, I can tell you from my own experience. Risk, not on my watch. That was the way we managed risk. That doesn't work anymore. If you're going to innovate, you've got to be out there. You've got to be on the leading edge of something. You've got to take a risk. The goal is not to take a risk. The goal is to take a managed risk. If you're going to fail, fail soon. Somebody a lot smarter than me said that. And that's what this is about, is figuring out how to take this forward in a way that's manageable and controllable. This is the only way to get ahead. Any questions about any of this? Anybody have any other ideas for things that should be in this column? You guys, I'm telling you now, I'll let you quiet, and if you don't start asking questions, I'm going to start asking you questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. When you mentioned about managing risks, can you give us an example of how you managed a risk, how you forecast a risk, and how you managed it?
Oh, sure. From my Citigroup experience, it would be really easy. I mean, I think this is probably not telling the details out of school. I think this is actually published. In the credit card, Citi card business, we employed 125 PhDs whose job it was to build analytical models about customer behavior and the linkage of customer behavior to essentially bad card debt. People stop paying, either slow down their payments or stop paying entirely. These 125 PhDs essentially made a science out of predictive analytics around credit card debt management and transactional behavior. In the credit business in particular, I mean, it's the classic example. And many banks did this in the economic downturn. Well, I can avoid risk by just not making any loans. And look at how hard it became to get a mortgage when the whole thing went south. That's risk avoidance. That is not risk management. Because most banks make a lot of money on loan. I mean, that's where they're making their money. They're taking deposits, they're making loans, and there's a spread. Right? And that's the oversimplified, but that's the business model of a bank. So that's one example. Another example would be doing pilot programs. You know, let's figure out a new way to do a branch that creates a better customer experience. We got 4,000 branches around the world. Probably not a good idea to change all 4,000 of them at once. So let's figure out a subset of those branches. We could do a test. Let's see how it works. If it works, we'll spread it to another 50 or another 100 or whatever. So there are lots of different ways, but it's all about thinking through the business value and trading off what the expense of the project is, what the cost of failure may be. And when I say failure, I don't mean it in a bad way, but rather that prototype or that pilot didn't work. It didn't meet the critical success factor for the definition of the expected outcome that we were looking for. That was okay. Okay? Does that help? So it's not about stopping doing something. Yes, sir.
On your key technology drivers, I noticed that you would not include the information security.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because it falls below the line of your
No, actually,
definition of keys?
it's a great question. You probably should add it. It's actually part of risk management is also information security, but I recognize what you're saying. There's a technology component to information security.
Right.
In this model, it's embedded in risk, cybersecurity
Right.
as part of risk management. All right. So that would be actually another great example to the young lady's question earlier. At Citi, when I was there, that was in 2004 to 2007, we probably dealt with order of magnitude on a daily basis, 250,000 attempts at reaching our firewall. 250,000 attempts a day. Right? And we talk about bleeding edge. I mean, we were working with every cybersecurity firm on the planet. We were working with the CIA. We were working with the NSA. All the three-letter government agencies we could find to figure out how to stay ahead of the curve. And that's another part of innovation, by the way, is simply just staying ahead of the competition. In this case, the competition was the bad guys. Right? Again, we want to talk about how these things are connected. In many countries in the world, it's not illegal to steal personally identifiable information or credit card information. If you know where to look on the internet, you can find the gray market or the black market. You can literally buy tens and thousands of credit card numbers with expiration dates and the pins that go with them. Interesting economics there, by the way. The bigger the list, the cheaper it gets, not because of the volume discount. It's because the half-life of a stolen credit card number is getting shorter and shorter. Right? So the bigger the list, the more likely that that number is no longer any good. But, you know, it's, yeah.
Can I ask you, or maybe, when you were doing Citigroup, right, problem that I see is that when you had those attacks, and some of them were successful,
Yeah.
but you are not allowed to announce that, right, because of the fear of the consumers.
Some of them
how
could announce
real
it.
is that?
Yeah.
How real is that threat? And how can you tell us that now?
Well, let me put it in a slightly different context. One of the dirty little secrets of financial services in general, this is an industry number, not a Citibank number or a Citigroup number. Over 70% of the actual financial losses incurred. Breach is one thing. A lot of breaches don't go anywhere. Right? A lot of times the firewall gets breached and the intruder gets caught somewhere else along the way. Or many breaches are just, in a weird way, it's like voyeurism, it's curiosity seekers. It's like, what can I see if I get on the other side and nothing ever happens to it. So if you look at the actual theft or financial loss, for the industry overall, more than 70% of the actual financial losses incurred come from internal as opposed to external sources, the employees of the company, which is sort of ironic because probably 70% or more of the budget is going to the external threat. But you really have no choice. I mean, I used to think about it like a drug war. It literally, in this case, is a technology battle. It's who's got the faster computer, who's got the better algorithm, how quickly can you catch these guys. And again, in many countries, this sort of intrusion is not illegal. And the U.S. laws have no jurisdiction in many of these countries. It's no longer kids in garages or in their bedroom with a TRS-80 figuring out, how to dial every number on the modem until they get in. That's interesting Hollywood stuff. Forgive me, Los Angeles. But, this is organized crime. In many cases, sovereign governments. Right? This is real stuff. That's why we used to work with the CIA and the NSA. At Citi, we used to have meetings on a regular basis, and we'd find these guys, and we'd work with governments to try to get them shut down. And we were reasonably successful at doing that, but guess what? The next day, they would just start up on a different TCP/IP address, or in a different city, or whatever it is, and it would just start all over again. Sure.
How do you perceive collaboration versus competition, and how do you think is that collaboration becoming a dominating or important part of the new business models?
Interesting question. Did everyone hear the question? This is, how is collaboration viewed in relation to competition? And is that impacting these new business models? The answer is yes, and to some extent, but the bigger thing that we're seeing with collaboration is collaboration with customers, not with potential competitors. There's some of that going on as well, and there's some mighty unholy alliances that get formed, generally broken up by the government and the antitrust. But what we're really seeing over and over and over again are companies that are connecting directly with their customers through social media, through mobile, through internet and broadband techniques, and figuring out what works, what doesn't work. One of the examples I really, really like is SAP implemented a collaborative innovation platform where essentially a system similar to a crowdsourcing system. They essentially created a contest, and they offered a prize, and it was $5,000 to the customer that could provide to them the best 5-minute video of how they used SAP software to innovate their business process. Now think about the brilliance of this, right? Think about the 1990s way of doing it, going back to Dilbert, right? So essentially you're looking for what enhancements or what improvements you should make to your platform to build into your product plan. And certainly you want to have customer input, but in the 90s that was a hard thing to do. Now it's not so hard. Right? So they literally create this platform that gives them the ability to reach their customers in real time. They offer a $5,000 prize. In the old way, by the way, they would have brought in the consultants and the marketing people and the advertising people, and 9 months later, $1 million, they might have had 2 or 3 reasonable ideas. Right? What they found was within about a 2.5 month period of time, they got back thousands of ideas, thousands. Right? The hard part was sifting through the noise. So, let's for argument's sake say that half of them were crazy. Nice try. That still leaves 22,000, 2,500 really interesting ideas, right? For which they paid $5,000, got it done in 3 months instead of 9 months. The amazing customer goodwill that happened along the way, and they probably got their product development roadmap for the next 10 years. And they maintain now ongoing conversations. People are crowdsourcing the design of automobiles, right? People are having cars built based on the wisdom of the crowds, if you will, now. The fact that it has 4 steering wheels and 3 wheels, the wisdom of the crowd. There's a TV show called Blog Cabin. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it, where essentially one of the designer shows buys an old, dilapidated, broken down house on the shores of the Chesapeake and essentially puts it out on a website. And they hire a designer to say, well, here's 3 different choices for the siding, and here's 4 different choices for the windows, and here's 3 different choices for what color the floor should be, and should we use stainless steel appliances or whatever. And literally, people vote. And this is a real person's house. Right? I mean, they actually get somebody to sign up for this. At the end of the day, they basically get a complete free makeover of their house, but they're sort of at the mercy of, I don't know, it's probably a couple million people at this point that are essentially weighing in and voting on what color their hardwood floor should be. Right? And it's just more and more and more of this stuff happening, literally daily. And it's all because of broadband and mobile and cloud that this stuff is taking place. Okay? This was the slide I referred to. So this came out of the CBL study that IBM did last year. It's a bit of a spaghetti chart, and I won't bore you with all of the details, but the important thing on this chart is essentially CEOs was asked, this was about 1,500 CEOs globally were asked to rank what they thought were the most important factors that were driving the future of their organizations. This gets back to the innovative business model conversation we were just having. What you see here is in 2010, after market factors, which clearly that's what CEOs worry about, technological factors was number 2, which actually moved up from number 6 in 2004. So between 2004 and 2010, technology has made almost to the top of the pile. We believe this is a direct recognition of the fact that at the CEO level, they get it. They absolutely get that their business is entirely dependent upon successfully executing the right IT strategy and ultimately the right implementation. Any questions about this one?
I have a question. How do you interpret the diminution of people's skills?
People went to 4 from 2. Right. Why is that? Yeah. Partly the bad economy and people are easier to find, but I think the real answer is CEOs aren't the ones worrying about the bench strength of their IT departments. If you ask CIOs this question, actually we did ask CIOs this question, and people actually came out ahead of IT from CIOs, because they're the ones with the problem.
Yeah.
They're the ones that when, the guy that wrote the COBOL code that makes it all work retires or resigns, and there's no documentation,
Yep.
and maybe there's not even any source code, what do I do now? Right? So people obviously become very important. So you have to put this in the right context of asking a CEO the question, but it's a great question. So here's where the research starts to get sort of interesting. So, what we're saying is sort of a replay of a lot of what I've talked about. So historically, IT has been all about making it faster, making it cheaper. What's happening now is these business models are starting to figure out that IT can go to the other side of the ledger. It's much more, and you've probably all heard the saying, you can't save your way to heaven, or maybe the other place, depending on whatever. So cost savings, the point is cost savings is finite. Revenue increase is not, conceptually. There's no limit to how much revenue you can generate in theory. But this was never really the case in IT, or rarely the case in IT up until fairly recently. We're starting to see investments in IT as a result actually increasing. Now, nobody should go back to their CEO or their CFO tomorrow. Remember the critical success factor, do one thing differently. Do not go to your CFO tomorrow morning and say, well, I heard Harvey Koeppel talk about this, and he said that the trend is IT budgets are increasing, so therefore I want more money in my budget. That's not what this is about. What this is really about is those companies that get this are starting to figure out, yeah, you can save a few million or a few hundred million or a couple of billion depending on your scale. By the way, at Citi I had a $2.8 billion operating budget. There's more zeros than even I could count. I like get eye problems just looking at the numbers on the page. But this is a direct recognition of the fact that there is this upside potential, and there's a tremendous amount of business value being left on the table by not recognizing this. But the punchline here, and I know many of you will relate to this, is there's still no widely accepted normative organizational theory of IT growth in medical. So what does that mean? That's definitely academic. Actually, this comes from Harvard Business School. It's both the source, and this is research that we're doing. And this was one of the models that was suggested. And what we're literally talking about as a way to help CIOs to capture, recapture the value that's being left on the table is by combining the competency model work that we've started doing around leadership, around business strategy, around organization and talent management. We'll see a bit of that in a second. But that's only half of the coin. Right? That's the CIO perspective. Again, interesting, necessary, but not sufficient. You've got to look at the other side of it too. You've got to look at where the organization is. Right? There are probably CIOs in this room that are sitting there saying, boy, I really get it, and I know how to lead, and I'm strategic, and I have all these great ideas and all these things about how we can innovate this and change that. And then I go and I talk to my boss or the CFO or the COO, whoever I report to, and they just don't get it. And I say, but it's only going to cost another X dollar, whatever. No, in fact, not only are you not getting those X dollars, I'm going to cut your budget by whatever. There's a dialogue missing that needs to happen. There's also an exchange, there's a culture, there's a mindset across the enterprise that needs to start to shift in order to really exploit the business value opportunity that we talked about for the last 20 minutes or so. So what we are looking at here, again, this is a research proposal to come up with a way to talk about the y-axis, which is the value realization from IT investments, which you see increasing. The x-axis is time. For the moment, at least, we have characterized, think of the stages of IT adoption, if you will, in any enterprise. And we're looking at launch, accelerate, refine, and integrate. Pretty fundamental, pretty basic. We can sit here and argue about whether those are the right words or not, but frankly, none of that's the point. Part of the point is you've got to have something to hang your hat on, to be able to measure, to understand sort of the way in which IT comes into the organization and ultimately generates value. So for the moment, at least, this is a reasonable way to look at it. Very important on this chart is this S-curve. This is the organizational learning curve as we're describing it. This is the readiness to accept and the ability of the organization to make the kind of changes that we're talking about making. And it's easy to say, man, this is fundamental shift in the way organization thinks about itself, and it's a whole different business model. And again, you know, this is where the theory and the practice need to come together. Sir?
Can't a lot of that be taken care of during the design phase? And where's the design phase? of all this?
Well, this is at a whole enterprise level. So on an individual project, yes, but there still needs to be some view at an enterprise level that understands what the business strategy is,
Right.
and then understands how technology can be deployed to support that business strategy. And in fact, I'll raise the bar even further. I talked early in my talk about the journey from manager of the IT cost center to business savvy CIO as sort of the archetype for where CIO, the role of CIO needs to go. Informally, we talk about, you know, you've made it to be a business savvy CIO, not when you score high marks on the aptitude test, but when you get invited into the business strategy planning conversation. At its inception, not because you have a C in your title, but because your business partners internally absolutely believe that you're going to add value to that conversation. Because you understand their business and you understand the technology and you know how to deal with social media or broadband or whatever technology you want to pick in order to drive that business strategy even further. Okay? The creation of mobile banking at Citibank is a perfect example. As CIO, I was visiting India, which in those days, I have no idea what's happened since, but Citibank was the largest non-Indian bank in India. And I went out to lunch with the country head, the guy that runs Citibank India, had a great Indian meal and got drunk as skunks. And in the back seat of the car on the way back to the office, I said to him, what keeps you up at night? You know, where do you see your business going? It wasn't a question about technology, it was a question about business. And it's like, what's your biggest obstacle? He said, you know, India's a tough market to crack because we've done a great job in the cities where there's infrastructure and we can build branches and all, but it's just not cost effective to reach most of the Indian population in the outlying areas. It just makes no sense to put a branch in a place where there may be 300 people in a village or whatever. And I'm looking for a way that I can get banking to everybody. This was in 2005. And I said to my colleague, well, what about if I could deliver to you a mobile branch? And he said, oh, you mean on a truck? And I said, no, not on a truck. On a little device that you can hold in your hand and put in your pocket. He said, you mean, oh, like on a cell phone? And I said, well, yeah, probably would use cell phone technology and maybe some other technologies. But don't think about it as a cell phone that does banking. Think of it as a branch that happens to have a cell phone in it. And we got to thinking about it, and wow, that's really kind of an interesting concept. I hadn't actually thought about it that way. Long story short, that was the beginning of mobile banking at Citibank, and frankly, one of the early pieces of work in mobile banking in the industry. But it came from, first and foremost, an understanding of the business problem. How do I get banking to people I can't reach and can't reach me? My understanding of the technology, of how I could help solve that problem. But the conversation we then had was a business conversation about how to leverage that technology to solve that business problem. It wasn't about whether we should use a Nokia phone or whether we should use an iPhone. There were no iPhones then, but you get the idea. It was purely in business context. So that's really what we're talking about. At that point in India, there was a readiness to change. Right? They were sort of in this stage, but they were willing to go through that pretty quickly. In most organizations, what you find is enormous resistance to change. And even if there's willingness to change, there's a readiness that's just not there. It's cultural, it's mindset, it's people changing. And I think we all have had the experience. It's a lot tougher to change people than it is to change a desktop. Right? So this curve is really important because really what we're now saying, and this gets to the journey, and in fact the competency model I refer to is the yellow side of this sheet. But what we're really saying is CIOs need to start to amp their game up from a manager to a leader, from looking at operational efficiency and expense reduction to innovation and growth. And I'm not going to stand here and read all this. You get the idea. But the punchline here is that when CIOs reach this stage, and this is not black and white, and this is not all or nothing, and this is not, I have to do all of these things perfectly, this is why it's called a journey, but the opportunity for the CIO can have the kind of conversation, drunk or sober, with their business person, has the opportunity to essentially accelerate the progress of this curve, to bring their enterprise to the integration stage more quickly than the CIO who is challenged by the remote control and is totally focused on the left-hand side of this page. Sir?
This is Rajesh from Water Music Group. So I think there are two hurdles that CIOs have or need to cross. One is perception that you're not close amongst equals, and the second is most of the projects overrun their budget or time. It's probably the nature of the beast. So you're always fighting the perception that you're not even meeting your operational goals, leave alone creating new product lines or.
Absolutely correct. And a really important point. Because if we look at this model, unless you get that stuff right, you might not even bother having the rest of the conversation. Because it's that stuff that establishes the credibility and the trust that allows you to have the conversation like the one I had. Of course, a couple of gallons of Kingfisher didn't hurt, but part of what I like to think of as relationship management and patience. But the point is, I mean, you can see it from this model, that if you can start having, and what does that mean? That means I go into the CBO's office, and 5 minutes is a long time to get to the CBO in anything. Right? If I start talking about 5 nines of availability, and I start talking about all this great work I did to consolidate 12 data centers into 2 data centers, and I saved $10 million, I'll get about another 5 seconds because if I saved the $10 million, but that's pretty much it. That conversation is over. If I go into that same CEO and I talk about what I'm doing to extend banking in India from a base of 20 million customers to 150 million customers, and I've now increased shareholder value and earnings per share, I might even get 10 minutes out of that conversation. I think there was a question back here, and then we'll come here.
I wonder, in this context of changing of the role of IT within an organization, obviously through the CIO, how much do you think IT is becoming more a driver factor in business strategy rather than just the support of the business strategy? Huge.
I think it's just at the beginning for all the reasons we're talking about here, because many IT professionals are still talking 5 nines and how much money they've saved, which again is not a bad thing. Right? Still need to be able to do that. All we're saying here is that's table stakes. Right? That's the starting point. Right? What that gives you is permission to have the other conversation. And we're starting to see that happen. Part of what's making that happen is we're definitely starting to see more CIOs come from the business as opposed to up the IT stack. Right? So they can already have that conversation. Now what they lack is the deep understanding of the technology. And that gets, by the way, in both cases, it gets back to bench strength, which unfortunately is sort of like cybersecurity. It's a bit buried here. Actually, here, what I've done for each of those competencies, and this will be in the slides, every one of those competencies we've defined a set of skills that are needed. So part of business management is, well, gee, it's not there. Well, we found a bug in my model here. There needs to be organization and talent management skills in there. It's about building the right bench strength, right? So yes, your life is a 24/7 crisis to crisis life. No doubt about it, my life was the same. Even though I knew how to speak to the CEO, actually it made it worse, because I inherited problems I never in my wildest imagination thought I'd be dealing with. Right? Bomb blows up in an Argentinian branch and the guard's dead. What do we do? Right? Because I was in charge of risk management. Right? This is a big risk. What do we do? And I'm in Tokyo at the time, by the way, managing this thing. But the point is, as CIO, you need to lead. Part of being a leader is knowing how to delegate. And there's plenty of crises that happen day to day. We don't need to invent any new ones. They just happen. But it doesn't need to be you as the CIO that has to be personally involved in every one of those things. What you need to do is be able to build the bench strength underneath yourself within your IT organization that can handle that stuff so that you're freed up to have the time to go have the good conversation with the CMO and talk about how you can increase cross-sell or increase upsell or increase market penetration or market share. How are you going to do that? By looking at unstructured data, by looking at big data, by looking at predictive analytics. But that's not the conversation you want to have. Right? What you want to talk about is, I think I can move the needle on cross-sell by 5%, which will add 20% revenue right to, or earnings right to the bottom line, because we've already spent the money. So by leveraging what we already have in a smarter way, we can generate more. And this is music to a marketing person's ears. Right? Similar with a CFO. Okay, you can talk 5 nines for about 5 seconds, same thing, right? But what CFOs want to know is, what's the ROI? Right? If I do this, what do I get for it? And it can't any longer just be about saving money. And it's got to recognize the difference between a balance sheet and a P&L and what the interactions are. And you need to speak CFO to the CFO, and you need to speak CMO to the CMO, and that's work. And you need to free yourself up from the day-to-day, oh my God, the email system just went down kind of stuff. Make sure you have the right people on your team to be able to handle that so that you can essentially be the ambassador, right? And at the same time, have familiarity. So the hook's coming out, I hope.
It's a big hook.
Let me just, there's one other slide I want to show you, and then the rest of it you can read at your leisure. This is the latest research that we are working on, which essentially combines the stages model with the competency model in a 2-dimensional way that we talked about, and we believe this is really the path to the 21st century CIO. And essentially what we're doing now is, not surprisingly, we've made a matrix out of it. We've got competencies down the side, we've got the stages of growth management across the top. And if you look at each of these stages launch, what we're saying is the skill sets, and part of the research is now filling in the blanks with the skills that were on the previous slides. But essentially, this is the journey from understanding business value to articulating business value to enhancing business value, and then to your exact question, how do you get to lead the value creation conversation? And we are literally in the beginning stages of this research to figure out, from both the enterprise point of view, which are the stages here, from the CIO point of view, which are the competencies, what skills do I need in each of these areas to get through each of these stages, and then essentially create a series of tools that let you first do the diagnostics, see where the gaps are, and again, this is from the enterprise view and from the CIO point of view. The prescriptive phase is, okay, I know where the gaps are, now what do I do about it? And then finally the execution or the value creation phase, which is essentially the implementation plan and getting it done. And then, of course, another virtuous cycle. So maybe the thing you want to do tomorrow, if you grab the slides, is read through this. There's a couple more pages. We pretty much have gone through it. But it brings all of this together. And stay tuned, because this is definitely a huge area for the center, and frankly, we believe for the industry overall, and for business schools and IT departments, to be able to really amp up the game here around the role of the CIO, the function of IT, and most importantly, the increased opportunity and business value creation. So I think with that, I will thank you all. Been great. Thank you for all the great questions.